Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Gottlieb. I'm the Executive Director of the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers. That is based in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I'm also the president of the Groningen Declaration Network. And I'd like to welcome you to our session today, exploring interoperability models that advance recognition, trust, and lifelong learning. I'll let my colleague Joanne introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanne Duklas. I'm here today representing the GDN Network, which is an international trust we'll talk a little bit more about later. I also happen to be someone who is a researcher and consultant in the field of mobility and have served as a former registrar AVP with a long history in higher education. So between Melanie and I, you're going to get the wealth of that history today as we share with you about the concepts we're going to be talking with you today about.
Thanks, Joanne. So here's how we think the session will go today. First, we're going to set the stage a little bit with context from the work that we're doing at GDN and what we're seeing in the network. We're going to introduce you to the network and its link to the concepts around lifelong learning. We're going to explore the trust ecosystem, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about that. And then we'll talk also about why this work matters. Then we will move into what I hope will be, what I hope will be an interactive session. We really want to hear from you. We have a few questions that we'd like to interrogate, and we'll move from there. All right, so first let's talk a little bit about setting the stage. In this morning's sessions, there's been an unspoken theme across the mobility of learning and the mobility for learners. And that unspoken theme is really the importance of building a network of trust. Every stage of interoperability, as you move credentials to and through from an issuance to an employability back into an education pathway, that network of trust and the markers of trust signal, one, to the learner that the education that they're receiving is worthwhile and worthy of the marketplace. It also signals to the receiving institution or the receiving employer that that credential has some value and recognition. And there are a myriad of pieces that are required to build that network of trust. It's not a single entity. It's not simply quality assurance. It's not simply technology. It's not simply educational programming. It is the integration of a number of players in order to formulate that program. So we're going to explore a couple of questions. And so before we set the stage and give you some information about GDN and the work that we're doing, I want to point you to these questions because we're going to come back to these questions for you. The first question is, how can we make recognition accessible to all learners through advancing interoperability across all of its dimensions? The second is, how might furthering interoperability further recognition across all learning? And third, what are the exemplar interoperable models and approaches that you would highlight? What's working and why were they successful? Because we hope to be able to build and improve and learn from those successful models. This is just the abstract. It's a lot of words. You can read it in the app, and so I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to highlight a couple of the key themes. At the GDN, we're really focused on moving beyond the aspirational of the recognition and the mobility of all learning and leveraging the network to move into action. We've seen over the last 12 years of the existence of the GDN that we are moving into that space. We are seeing successful models, we are seeing momentum, and we want to continue to grow that momentum. We really want to think about system-level digitization strategies because key to ensuring all learning is mobile is getting that learning captured digitally and putting it in the hands of the learner. And then talking about how interoperability and open standards, both technical interoperability, also semantic interoperability, and philosophical interoperability, play into that recognition model.
So I want to talk a little bit about the GDN network so that people are aware of what it means and why we're involved in this space. And it's linked to the world of recognition and verification. First, let me be clear that GDN is an international community of thought giants, shall we say. And we're active in the fields of recognition, policy, learner mobility, and technology. The community includes government, vendor colleagues, as well as industry partners, academic faculty, and more. So what we found is that they working together, setting the batons down at the door, shall we say, and being open to new ideas and convergence and collaboration, we've been able to lead and influence some significant system level change for learner mobility. It is a trusted, a trust out of the Netherlands. So depending on your region, a society, a not-for-profit, almost like a charity, if you will. And people contribute to it both to help it sustain its work, but also to help evolve the change that's going on. We do this by catalyzing a network of networks model. And there's various dimensions to that, which are relevant to this particular epic convening. Supporting privacy regulations, for example, the Global Convention, which is a very critical instrument along with the other regional conventions that produce larger policies for why we should even be in this room today and supporting lifelong learning and recognition. We work hard to help people surface their practices and rethink them and transform how we go about our work. We inspire networks. For example, the GDN 100% inspired MyCres Macertif in Canada, MyEquals in Australia, some of the wonderful work that's going on with ACRO in the US, with our partners in China, CSSD, and many, many more around the world. We also spend a lot of time working with standards bodies. Some of them are here today. We work closely with them to help advance their work as part of the GDN network. We advance collaboration and best practice. We enable and support interoperability. We, in fact, have an interoperability study coming out, which is going to be available to you very soon in our newly launched website, which is the anchor for this presentation today. And we spend a lot of time advancing knowledge building with the community, including things like webinars, convenings, and the like. We have ethical principles that we operate by. These help us to get on the same page collectively. Things like supporting privacy regulations, supporting learners, supporting learner ownership of their credentials, and so on. All the kinds of things you've been talking about this morning. And we do this by having our members, our participants, I should say, we don't have members, our participants sign to the ethical principles. We have institutions, governments, and organizations. SACWA, for example, is a longstanding member, participant, and signatory to the GDN, and there's many others. ACRO's a founding member, et cetera. What is the link to this particular convening today? We are looking at how we can move around all this kind of data in a way that is done ethically with the student front and center, open standards and support for organizations such as ePIC and our other communities, and to ensure that it is done in a trusted, quality assured, and official manner. Because when you look at the recognition discussions this morning, and I had an interesting conversation about residency with a colleague today, and another colleague about the various tools. When you look at all of these things, these are about not only enabling the learner experience, but moving around the outcomes of that experience in a way that can be used to advance rapid access to work and learning. And that is what the GDN works hard to achieve. We do this through a network of networks model. And so in the slide deck that we'll be sharing, there is a link to a case for change that talks about these philosophies and that are, I can see, woven through much of the conversation we're hearing today so that we can catalyze the art of the possible for learners. So I want to take a moment, along with Melanie, to sort of explore that trust ecosystem a little bit further and go into the interoperability space. So over to you, Melanie, to talk about the principles of interoperability.
The first level of interoperability that we need to think about is philosophical interoperability. And when I speak about that, I mean, we need to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction, that there's a set of principles that we are, and a set of baseline assumptions that we're all working against. In the US, because we are likely to never sign the Global Convention, that's just not a reality for us, we have to work differently. And the way that we work differently is through our higher education associations. We don't have a Ministry of Education, we have a Department of Education. And so the way that we socialize principles and catalyze action is through higher ed associations. So ACRO has convened a group of the practitioner higher ed associations who engage in work that is tied to the mobility of learning. And we've tested a series of principles with them. We've collected, I think, more than 20 sets of principles that are active in North America that are around this concept of the mobility of learning. And we've distilled them down to these 8. And these 8, while the language may not be perfect, because we're all going to speak slightly differently about them, the concepts seem to resonate across all the organizations. So we believe that U.S. higher education can get behind these 8 principles around learning mobility. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them that I think are really key. The first is that they be designed for all users. And when we say all users, we have to ensure that we're equipping the learners who are emerging today, so our youth, as well as people like me who have been out of higher education for a long time. We need to make sure that we're equipping our refugee populations, that we're equipping any population that has traditionally had challenge accessing credentials. We need to make sure that they're all designed with every learner in mind. Another one that I'm going to skip over interoperable because that's really the overarching theme. The next thing I want to highlight is skills-based. So the language of learning is emerging as a skills-based language. In higher education, we've not always been comfortable talking about our learning as skills-based. Often we separate theory from practice. And we're finding that in order to make learning mobile, we're going to have to dig a little deeper into the underlying skills that our learners are receiving from the learning and articulate them clearly and map them to skills frameworks in order to ensure that that they have all of the mobility access that they can. Another one that I want to highlight is just briefly is individual agency. And this is something that in the US, I think we're not quite prepared to get there, but it is absolutely the way that the field is moving, that learners need to have some sovereignty over their record. They need to be able to share their learning whenever they want, with whomever they want, from wherever they are. And that's a reality that we have to build towards. The last one I want to highlight is just survivable. As we've had lots, that survivable means that regardless of whether or not the issuing organization still remains, the learning happened. The credential happened. And so we have to design credentials and artifacts of credentials to be survivable beyond the entity that issued them. This is especially important now as we see the myriad of third-party providers, corporate providers, many of which are issuing credentials that are quite valuable, but they may not always be there, and they may not always be the same entity. And so it's important to design credentials in that way. These 8 themes also really resonate. We did this separate from GDN work, but unsurprisingly, really align beautifully with the work of the GDN and the principles of the GDN.
And when you look at this overarching set of themes, it's an example of semantic interoperability where a community is coming together. We had the same issue when we were putting together MyCreds in Canada, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, where we needed to get on the same page about philosophy, principles, and nomenclature. This is because we have such a diverse set of actors that typically get involved in these kinds of initiatives. All of you know this. I can hear this from your commentary thus far. And so I do want to amplify a couple of things. When we are doing our work, we're talking about the mobile transfer learner. And so there's issuing organizations, there's receiving organizations, there's distribution providers. An example might be Parchment in the US or CSSD in China or MyEquals in Australia or an organization called Duo in the Netherlands. There are organizations, government or privately owned or not-for-profit owned, that actually are helping you distribute the credentials and artifacts of learning. They are new, relatively. The very first one began in the UK in the early 70s. That was UCAS. Today, there's many, many more, and some are in the room today and part of the convening for this particular organization, but it's relatively new. Most came into being in the 2000s. And so we've had to help our recognition credential evaluators and our policy leaders understand these organizations and the importance of them. And then, of course, all of you know this, there are accrediting and quality assurance organizations. So if you think about the South African presentation that we just saw, and trying to map micro-credentials and RPL against qualification frameworks, that is a very common form of conversation that we are involved in our work internationally in order to help with alignment so that we can actually build the systems and digitize the credentials that are aligned with recognition frameworks around the world. And this is the final green bullet that talks about supporting technology and standards. The whole trust ecosystem is also surrounded by new concepts for trust frameworks. A good example is a relatively new term under verifiable credentials, which are called trust registries. And trust registries serve not only a public-facing role, but also a technical role because they enable interoperability. And we created one up in Canada, which listed all the recognized institutions, not only for public use, but also so that we can be ready for that day when we fully launch the verifiable credentials that have been produced. So when we think about the themes of practical interoperability or technical or syntactic, et cetera, some of those pieces start to emerge for us. And our recent research, as well as our dialogue, which has been enduring through the GDN, we have deemed it very, very important to foster global collaboration and data exchange standardization through greater engagement with the standards bodies, for example. And in fact, there's a new initiative called Data Standards United, which has been led by our good colleagues from PESC and AFRL, et cetera, which is looking at how can we work across standards and map them in order to achieve greater technical interoperability. There's been quite the movement towards promoting what are called open standards. This is where if one technology provider uses the badging standards, that it can in fact be shared across industry partners or industry channels so that the learner's not locked down to one home, shall we say. So open standards are the key language, if you will, to sharing of data. Back to Melanie's point, that notion of user-designed systems, technology, and environments and quality assurance frameworks. You know, we heard that in Ms. Travers' presentation when she talked about making sure that we're responding to looking at what somebody's achieved as opposed to just what we think they should have achieved. Investing in something called verifiable credential technologies. So moving even further than we have been with PDFs and badging and blockchain, et cetera, which is a form of VC. So how do we do that? How do we interoperate across all these technology platforms in order to create a frictionless experience for a learner when they're moving their credentials around and sharing them with you? We also have to spend a lot of time thinking about adoption in education. So when we were doing the Canadian project, we actually started in 2014, but we didn't actually launch our first school until November 2020. And I was talking with a colleague this morning where they were saying we're experimenting with badges now. We're there in terms of knowing what we need to do, but to try and build the coalition of the willing, the funding, and the support so that we can do it even at the institutional level, let alone cross-institutionally, is not a small task. And it's a people change project. So even when thinking about technical interoperability, that people change element is very much there. And then we have to consider what I call translation and bridges, because the reality is our institutions are not going to be quick to move off of their existing legacy systems. So how do we build a bridge to that reality so that they can participate in this space? And we spent a lot of time working on that when we were implementing the national network, where we actually had to create APIs, we had to look at what was the most common data standards used, we had to build nomenclature and a schema for micro-credentials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we did all of that with basically no funding, and again, the coalition of the willing, because we had in our country no national directorship of education. It was all these different, diverse, hundreds of institutions and parties that we had to convince across 22 ministries of education, essentially, to participate in play. And we need to continue doing that work. So it's exhausting, but it's important. We also then needed to think about architecture design, and some of these, and this gets at to the practical interoperability even deeper. Some countries have in place what's called a central depository. Netherlands is like that, where DUO as a government stores everything, and then they work with partners in the country who play a role in transmitting that information around, such as the StudiLink, et cetera. An exchange network is like EMRICS in Europe, which is really an extraordinary exchange where learners can take their data and records information from one institution, give permission for it to be put on the transcript of another institution and done instantly. It doesn't get much airtime, but it's a wonderful example of interoperability in Europe. Then there's the hub and spoke model, which we kind of did in Canada and which is in Australia and New Zealand, where in fact what we recognized is institutions have this legacy technology that we're not going to change, we're not going to be able to change, but we need to get their information into a partition environment in the Amazon Web Cloud, and then we need to be able to enable the learner to go in and decide who it goes to. They can't touch it, they can't modify it, but it moves out to spokes, through spokes in a wheel around the world so that it can be accessed. And badges are in that environment, as well as regular documents using XML. And we've also created a facility for it to use verifiable credentials. Wonderful partners, service partners that are working with us to achieve that, Parchment and Structure Company, as well as Matter. So it was really quite extraordinary, but an example of a hub and spoke. And the Matter piece is an example of the fourth one on this list, which is distributed verifiable credential technologies, or what you would know as blockchain. And there's wonderful work around the world to do that. So you don't have to have one architecture design. You can add and stack architecture designs, but you need to think about how to create the mapping and the interoperability to achieve that. And then you also have to think about the options open to you. Is it going to be PDF? Is it going to be open badge? Are you going to attach XML to the PDF? Is there a learner and employment record? What is it based on, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot underneath the hood that we won't be able to get to talking about today, but these are the kinds of considerations, and you need the expertise at the table to make it happen. And typically there's policy and procedural changes, et cetera. So in the interest of time, I'm just giving you a taste today. We're happy to talk throughout the conference on other pieces, as well as we'll have a paper coming out soon with regards to this. We do want to quickly give a couple of examples of successful efforts at interoperability, because we think it's important to highlight these. So I'll hand it over to Melanie to talk about Credential Engine.
Yeah, I'm just going to highlight one, which is Credential Engine. It is a US-based organization, and what they have a number of initiatives where they are counting credentials. That's the first initiative. They thought in the US, they started, how many credentials exist within the US education system. And they're well over 1 million credentials they've counted already. And they're collecting those credentials that are being issued by institutions, and they're listing them in their database using a WC3 data standard that operates on linked data, and it's very, very transparent. Because one of the pieces that we think is important about the work of Credential Engine is that it is bringing a level of transparency to individual credentials. And we firmly believe that one important piece of developing a network of trust in order to enable mobility is transparency. Do you want to talk about another?
Yeah, and I will say that Taylor's here this week, so he'll be sharing more about Credential Engine, and it's really important because of the not just moving student data, but course and credential data. The other one I want to highlight is the University of Lethbridge example. They were the first university they're a university, but they're the first school in Canada to officially launch on the MyCreds Masertif platform in Canada. And they had a student information system that was from a well-known vendor, et cetera. They were using XML, et cetera. They launched with their transcripts, some letters, and so on. But then recently, they also worked with Orbis, which is a vendor that looks after co-curricular or learning experiential records. And so also through that same environment, through the MyCreds environment, they've now launched an experience transcript, which has all that non-formal and informal learning outlined, and it's all been quality assured and assessed. And the goal was to enable the learners access, certainly to employment and work. But interestingly, it can be bundled in their MyCreds virtual wallet with their other academic credentials, badges, et cetera, so that they can create one package under the profile mechanism and move that out to learners. That particular initiative is working across a series of technology platforms and technology data standards, but doing it in such a way that for the learner, it looks like one purse, branded as one purse, and it's across all these learning realities. And that's, I think, the concept of user design in action and interoperability in action, making sure that for the learner, there is not 5 different campus counters they have to go to, making sure that everything they need is in one spot and that they can access it within seconds as opposed to days, and that they can cherry pick and choose what it is they want to present to a future employer or a future school for entree. This has high value for RPL, high value for access for transfer and admissions, and high value for access to work. Because the recipient at the other end, the employer, the school, they actually don't have to be part of the network in order to access these official documents. They actually could just get an email with a link in it, for example. So I think if we're looking to the future vision for interoperability, that's the high goal, is to create a trusted network where the learner has everything in one place with a level of assurance and confidence themselves, but also that they can transmit it to others and others can have that same sense of confidence that it's official. So these are ones we can talk about more further at the convening throughout the next couple of days if they're interested. And there's many more that we can get into. And what I'd like to do now is actually go back to those questions that Melanie and I proposed, because we're always looking for good practice examples. We're always looking to understand what are some of the barriers, and also wanting to appreciate better if we're getting it right with our work and our advocacy, or if we need to shift gears. I mean, what do you need in order to achieve more access for learners. So with that, I'll first hand it over to Melanie, and we're looking for the audience to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, refresher of these questions. Thinking about the context we've already given you, how else can we work to make recognition accessible to all learners through advancing interoperability? How might furthering interoperability further recognition across all learning? And what are some exemplars that you see that we didn't mention?
So I'm coming from the UK's Digital Badging Commission. So we're looking to try and get the UK to get to somewhere that might be an exemplar in the future. I don't have any exemplars. I'm looking for exemplars of what a good system might look like. So in the UK, lots of digital badging takes place. Lots of it's recognising informal learning. Increasingly, institutions like universities, colleges, schools are using badging to reward learning in all sorts of different ways, formally and informally. But there is no central system in the UK for recognising any of that learning, whether it's university level qualifications all the way down to informal digital badging. And I guess I do have a question. I don't know whether this is the sort of forum for it, which is, what is the role of government in the cases that you've seen in delivering that central interoperable system?
Do you want to go first, Melanie?
Sure. So I think my very official answer is it depends. I'll say in the U.S. context, the role of government is to get out of our way, because in the U.S. the government isn't particularly actively engaged. We hope that they will be inspired by the work that we're doing, perhaps provide some financial support, although I'm not going to hold my breath. But we've identified a few policy measures that may need to change or evolve. And when I say policy, I'm talking big P government policy as opposed to small p institutional policy. And so there are a few policy levers that might need to evolve in order for the space to be enabled faster. And so in our context, that's the role of government. I've seen other contexts, smaller governments like, say, Norway, very centralized. They're creating the technical infrastructure. They're creating the interoperability. Now, the scale is quite different. You know, in the US, we have 2,300 higher ed institutions, plus another 1,500 or so other institutions that need to play in that space. The scale is quite different.
So I'll add a little bit, and then my colleague from BC has some thoughts. I would come at it with another lens, in the sense that we desperately wanted government support for the work we were doing in Canada. Very challenging, and I would have loved it. I think the government plays an incentivizing role. The government can help inspire system level change, because just by the very mechanisms at their disposal, funding, policy, regulations, and the like, it does vary. Duo from the Netherlands is 100% government. And if it hadn't been for Duo, I'm not sure what they would have been able to achieve. And there's been wonderful work there. So I think context definitely matters, and the different communities, shall we say, in each region can really texturize that. When we got grant funding for our virtual skills wallet project, that was from government, was significant and very powerful. So I know my colleague from BC wants to add something, and I see some hands raising. So
she's going to
I'll speak quickly because I see there's other people that want to speak. My name is Susan Fursell, and I'm from British Columbia, Canada. I work at Thompson Rivers University. And when we became a university in 2005, part of our mandate was to do a provincial credit bank. And what that means is a repository of other types of credentials that aren't traditionally recognized in formal, with formal post-secondary institutions and that formal learning. So 2 years ago, the provincial government came to us and said, you haven't fulfilled that part of your mandate. Can we help you with that? And I know that sounds weird, a government saying, can we help? But we're just in a third project right now, building towards what we're calling a provincial credit bank, where we'll go in and we'll pre-assess other people's training and learning, and then we'll put it into a repository working with the British Columbia BC CAT, which was referenced earlier. And the hope is this is going to give people more mobility in the learning that they have and the different types of learning. So back to Nan Travers' presentation earlier today, to assess that what we cherish, to make that a little bit bigger and a little bit more meaningful for a more wider variety of people.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Michał Nowakowski from Poland, from Education Research Institute, and we actually do the governmental, technical, and methodological infrastructure. And we have 30 people working only on micro-credential standards and micro-credential wallet and issuing platform for micro-credential. And we have the Polish government support and the European Union support, like it's almost $6 million to the project, 3 years of project, to how to put the micro-credentials in the policy of Polish government.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, around is how do we meaningfully equivalency map these things? So across kind of types of credential across countries without upsetting people?
Yeah.
Because, you know, we have issues with this stream of universities, and we can't even credit transfer between degree courses in the UK in any way meaningfully, let alone compare degrees across countries in a way that is meaningful. So kind of this relies on that equivalency network, but how do we get buy-in for everyone without really upsetting a lot of people?
I'll make one comment about that, and then I think we have a question here. So in the US, there's a lot of resistance to that sort of equivalency mapping because the primacy of the decision-making and the autonomy of the institution is quite strong. And we don't have a centralized body. That said, it doesn't mean that we should not build the frameworks to compare. And I'm a firm believer that the more information that we have about credentials and those data elements that we listed on the slide, those are key to determining equivalence and comparability. It's always going to be the receiving institution that's going to make that decision. But I think the more transparency we put into the system, it starts to eliminate academic bias. That is what is existing in some cases. And will help smooth the pathway.
Just before our colleague speaks, the other thing I would say is you asked about the role of government, and you happen to be in the same region. Government can help incentivize research in this space through funding to help enable adoption. There are examples in other regions. MREX, I cited earlier, these equivalencies didn't happen just by chance over time, but sometimes watching where students naturally go can actually create focused projects for pilots that then become fundable, shall we say, to break down some of those barriers. And I've seen jurisdictions where they have created MOUs, if you will, where they say for these programs, we will do this kind of mapping. A good example is from British Columbia. They've created not only a domestic transfer equivalency system and technology so that a learner can go in and actually see that X course equals Y experience, but they've now expanded it to include international courses. So I think the rationale for doing it, which is important to governments as well as in regions, is that actually, and we saw it earlier today, recognition leads to economic opportunity, both for a local institution, but also for the learner and for the local economy. It leads to efficiencies And it leads to faster access to future studies, upskilling, as well as work. So you have to also figure out how to make that case for change and get the coalition of willing together. So not easy to do, but one of the things we took out of this slide was a roadmap for how to do some of this stuff. We did that because we wanted to hear more from you, but we can put it back in and give it to Dawn, and it's just a high level step 1, step 2, et cetera, and we can talk further. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Mine's not so much a question, but more comments, I think. And I'm going to base this on the South African context. I was just a little bit inspired by his question. In South Africa, you could almost say the NQF-MIS, which Ntabi was talking about earlier, it's a little bit of that. And it had that information and that build-up by the government. There was a bit of policy behind it. Everybody who's involved in education in South Africa will submit X, Y, and Z information to the South African Qualifications Authority. So there's a bit of legislation there. However, what I find myself thinking is, so this thing was created years ago. How do we move from where it was and consider the opportunities to grow it beyond where it's currently for? I don't have the answer, it's just a question. And then the second part I wanted to talk about is, obviously there are different contexts in the room. Within Africa, we will always think about the digital divide and digital literacy, which we mentioned this morning. So are there other countries within the network that may experience this sort of digital divide? I mean, we're not even there yet. We're not technologically, we're still somewhere here. And how do we, that's a big Rubicon to cross. So how do we move there before we start talking of all of this? I think those are just the initial comments that I have.
So I would just quickly say, not an easy answer. I was on the PSEC Cloud Advisory Group, so I'm familiar with some of the South African rich work in this space, and look forward to more. We run into things even where regions don't have the bandwidth, right, to be able to play in the digital space on their cell phones, et cetera. So every region, again, is different, but this is where the government plays a major role because they're helping to build infrastructure in order to create readiness for the digital divide. I can think of a zillion different ways government can help, but sometimes that's the barrier, and I think that's the key question, is what are the barriers in your region? Once you figure out the problems to solve that are unique to your region, then it's about prioritizing what those are and scaling them almost on a hierarchy of need. You have to do this before you can do that, then that, then that. So let's map it out and do it. And there's some great work in Australia where they've done exactly that, where they've said, you know what, we need to focus on nomenclature first, then we need to do this for micro-credentials, et cetera, et cetera. It creates a real clear line of sight for a roadmap. And back to your other question about how do you continuously improve? Continuous improvement should be baked into every project. You should always be asking, what more could you do better, differently, and what do you have to do to evolve? But it's, again, not easy to do, especially when funding is specific to a start and end point with very specified deliverables. But I do think from an ethical point of view and from a just sheer, I'd be bored if we didn't do it, there's a real opportunity to keep trying to think and push the envelope and change the paradigm. You know, you think quality time resources, how do we change the paradigm when we have those constraints? And sometimes transforming the entire process might be the secret. So how to create the case for change for that, we don't know, but it's a collaborative adventure and worth asking. Sorry.
So I realize we're out of time. So very, very quickly here, in terms of the trust and building trust across the ecosystem, one of the outcomes from Credential as You Go that we are working on right now, and just to kind of think about the government, is that we've been funded by a very large federal grant out of the Department of Ed, as well as some other foundations. So, but one of the things that we've been able to collect from all the institutions within the network are what does it take to create all these different credentials? And so we have a tool that we've developed with 20 different factors that kind of need to be in place, so that we're really looking at, can we work with the institutions to have certain things in place so that institutions can trust institutions, which then means it impacts learner mobility.
I'd love to hear more about that. We're at our time.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the work that Credential As You Go is doing is excellent. And so if you haven't checked it out, please do.
Thank you, Melanie.
So I think we're at our time. We just want to say thank you for listening today. We hope we've given you some food for thought. And our emails are up here if you want to follow up. You can take a picture of that. And we look forward to chatting throughout the conference.
Thank you.